as some of you are wrapping up, we're going to start answering these first two questions that we're using to focus ourselves today anyway. So the first one is simply a number. How many fingerprints do you think are necessary to establish a person's presence at a particular place? And this is assuming nobody's going around planting evidence, of course. But how many are necessary? Everybody say one? Yeah, I'm seeing people holding up one finger. Assuming nobody's planting stuff, all it takes is that one. So it's not about quantity then. But number two here, how can there be such a thing as too much evidence? Or too many fingerprints? Go ahead. Forensic scientist guy.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Like if it just takes so long to find them all, you know?
Uh-huh.
Find out who they belong to and all that stuff.
And why is that a problem?
Because it takes forever. And then it'll be all, you know, not usable anymore.
Okay. What are some other reasons why too many fingerprints could be an issue? Yeah.
But if you find 11, you might have a problem.
What do you mean?
If you find like 11 different fingerprints.
Oh, that belong to the same person?
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay. You're trying to find one person who was at a party. Yeah.
I guess if you have too many like different fingerprints, it would be more difficult to figure out like what the story was behind it.
Okay. Good. The more we have, the more potential people we have to eliminate. And you talked about, you know, how much time that takes, and that's important. So we're going to start thinking about this in terms of using this evidence in our writing, how we use this evidence in our writing. Go ahead and click submit at the bottom of that slide. So, criminal investigators, and I'm not going to just read this, but it's here if you want to read through it. Criminal investigators talk about evidence that tells a story. That when we collect evidence as criminal investigators, what we're trying to do is piece together the series of events that happened in order to figure out who did what. So, in a way, collecting the evidence and analyzing it allows you to tell the story of the crime. But just 2 minutes ago, we talked about how there can be too much evidence, too many fingerprints. So it's not just about the quantity of the evidence that you collect, but about the quality of the evidence. And I mentioned here something about if you have 20 smudged fingerprints that you can't identify, that doesn't really help you. But if you have that one clear one, even if it's partial, but it's got enough information in it, that can be something that helps us get to identifying who this person is. We're going to use that same kind of thinking to talk about persuasive writing. Somebody asked me the other day, how much evidence do we need? And I kind of hemmed and hawed for a second and hesitated. Not because I don't know, but because I don't like to think in those terms of how much do I need. It's sort of like asking, how long should this paper be? Well, my answer is almost always long enough to answer the question. Okay. So what we're trying to focus on, now that you've started to gather some evidence and you've got a collection today, is where are the quality pieces of evidence that are going to prove that you're right? And we're going to work today on how to include that evidence in the essay in an effective way and in a way that makes sense to you and to your reader. Because that's our goal. If we're going to convince somebody, we need to be able to be convincing to another person, to a reader. Go ahead and click continue at the bottom of that slide. Are we thinking? We're thinking. You'll come to the Common Core standard, the learning target, and our scale. So according to the Common Core State Standard, we need to be able to cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. And notice this part, including determining whether text leaves matters uncertain. That's the topic of our writing this week. Is the pardoner an evil guy who just happens to tell a really virtuous story? Or is he tricking his audience into listening to him by claiming to be a bad guy, just so maybe they'll be a little bit more interested in who he is as a person and might listen to his story a little bit better? So there is some uncertainty in the text. That's one of the reasons I picked it. So what are we trying to do today? What we're trying to do today is develop evidence, our evidence table that we started last time, into writing, into paragraphs, in order to analyze the pardoner as a character. And I have a format for you that if you use it, you will be successful, period. If you don't use it, then you're kind of like throwing a bunch of playing cards in the air and hoping that a couple land on upside down that say 21. So, here's our learning target. If you're at a 4, you can effectively use smaller chunks of the evidence I collected from the story within the lead quote transition format to explain my opinion about the pardoner and his claims to be evil. You would also, if you were a 4, be confident that you could use that format in analyzing another character in another piece of literature without additional support. If you're at a level 3, you can effectively integrate those smaller chunks of your quotations of your evidence using that format. If you're at a 2, which is probably where almost all of us are today, you're at the level where you have been able to collect your evidence. You can probably explain how that evidence supports your opinion about the pardoner. You can select smaller chunks within your evidence that you're going to use and say, this is the part of the quote that I'm going to use in my writing. If you're at a 1, maybe you think you can do some of this, but maybe not all, or you need support to do it. And if you're a 0, then you don't think you can do this at all. Type your answer in that box. I reformatted this because remember when I did multiple choice, it mixed it all up? So I'm using a different format so that it's more clear and organized. So here you'll just type a number in the box to tell me where you think you are right now.
Has to be a whole number.
It should be a number between 1 and 4.
Oh, okay.
Huh? Wonderful. I love 3.1. It's my second favorite number. Did you know that?
Didn't know that.
I just decided. So it's going to give you some feedback. Go ahead and continue. To the next slide. All right. So remember that what we're trying to do today is use this evidence in a way, in a particular format, this transition lead quote format. You'll hear lead quote transition and transition quote lead, they're all the same. Very often what we have, and what you have today, is you probably have large chunks of text, like the example I showed you yesterday. You have a large chunk of text and why you think it matters to your argument. What we want to do now is pare it down to a phrase, a smaller phrase, maybe even a whole sentence, but part of one, to be able to use it effectively in our writing. So I've given you this as an example from the article that you read about the governor who pardoned all those people in 2012. So here's a sentence or a passage from that article. Victims and their relatives complain that blind justice has been supplanted by caprice. The state's attorney general, a Democrat, points out that not all of the beneficiaries seem to have fulfilled the Constitution's requirement that they provide 30 days notice of their intention to seek a pardon in a local newspaper. Now, that passage, while interesting, is way too long to put into a short essay. It's two sentences, but the second one takes up almost 2 full lines. So what we really need to do is focus on what is it in this quote that we want to focus on. What piece of information is it that we want to point to and say this is really important? So one way to do that is to decide what it is that you want to point out as the writer. The evidence here suggests that there may have been some wrongdoing, or malfeasance, remember that prefix, mal. There may have been some wrongdoing or malfeasance on the part of the governor. So if I want to focus on that aspect of it, that malfeasance, I'm going to quote the part of the passage that indicates the wrongdoing. The Attorney General said that not all the criminals pardoned. That's not a quote. That's my paraphrase of some information. Then I'm going to quote this last part. The Attorney General said that not all the criminals pardoned, quote, seem to have fulfilled the Constitution's requirement that they provide 30 days notice of their intention to seek a pardon in a local newspaper. And then I've got my parenthetical citation at the end. And just for reference, I've given you how this would appear on a bibliography. So what I've done is I've taken out only a small chunk of this passage, of this whole thing, in order to focus on the malfeasance. Does that make sense? Okay. If I wanted to focus on what he's violating by doing all these pardons, what portion of that quote might I want to pull out specifically? If I want to say he's violating this particular part of the law, am I asking it right? Or am I confusing you? What part of, how do we know that he's done something wrong? Because he's done what? What has he violated? Okay, thank you. The Constitution's requirement. So this isn't just some guideline. If we want to focus on the fact that he's violating the Constitution, we can pull that particular portion out. Could we pull out a section of the quote to indicate that, to focus on the fact that they didn't do it, that they didn't request these pardons given a certain time period? Okay, barking dog. Or that one kid who sounds like a barking dog. We could pull out this notion that they didn't provide 30 days notice, couldn't we? So it depends on what it is you want to focus on. Go ahead and click continue with me, please. So here we are to the TLQ model, transition lead-in quote. I'm going to give you a list of transition words and phrases that I'm going to ask you to use for every quote that you provide in your response. One of the most common transition phrases is, for example. Why would we use for example all the time? What comes right before you say, for example?
Statement.
Okay. You've made a statement about something, and now what does the for example do?
Proves it.
Helps to prove it. You've made a statement, you've made a claim. For example, you're going to support it, you're going to prove it. For example, for instance, as an illustration, in fact, all do that. And I'm going to show you some of the categories that you can use. So let's say the statement was that the Attorney General erred, made a mistake, when he pardoned these 200 and more people. We can say, to introduce this quote, instead of just starting, the Attorney General said that not all the criminals pardoned, etc., we're going to say, for example, the Attorney General said that not all the criminals pardoned fulfilled the state's requirement, etc. So our intention there is to move from our statement and transition to our example. That's why it's called a transition. We make a claim, and then we don't just list proof, we transition into our proof. So, very quickly, which of the following transition words or phrases do you think does not indicate that an example is about to be offered? For example is one way to say, here comes some evidence. One of these is not a way to introduce evidence that supports the statement. Which one is it? Take 30 seconds and decide, and then click your button. And then we'll check. One of these does not indicate that a supporting example is going to be offered. Does specifically suggest that we're about to have some more evidence that supports our point. Yeah. Does, on the other hand, I'm seeing some shaking heads, does, of course, indicate that there's going to be something in support? How about to illustrate? Specifically, to illustrate, very obvious that we're about to come up with examples that are going to support our point. Of course does that too. It can lead to, this one can lead to a contrasting point of view as a way to say, well, obviously, but on the other hand. But on the other hand, definitely says we're about to hear something that's contrary to our main point. Don't worry if you click something else. It's just a piece to see where we're all at. So we know that we're going to use a transition, a transitional word or phrase. The other thing we're going to do is use a lead-in. And I'm going to suggest today that there's two basic ways to do a lead-in. Oh, come on. I did give you an answer. The lead-in is the part of the quote where you provide either a summary of information that you didn't put in your quotation or an indication about the significance of the information that's about to be quoted. So, for example, these got formatted a little incorrectly. They're supposed to be moved in so you can see the difference between the example and the instruction. So in this top example right here where it says, for example, this is our sentence that we were just looking at. For example, the Attorney General said that not all of the criminals pardoned seem to have fulfilled the Constitution's requirement. I summarized the state's Attorney General, a Democrat, points out that not all of the beneficiaries. I summarized that into this passage that I thought was more clear, and I didn't think it was necessary for me to quote that entire introductory idea. So all I've done is paraphrase a chunk of the original quote. So this is where we're talking about distilling down to smaller chunks of information. The other method, aside from simply summarizing information, is to use it to indicate the significance of what you're about to say. Here's my example of that one. For example, the Attorney General suggested wrongdoing by the governor when he said that many of those pardoned had not, quote, fulfilled the Constitution's requirement. Here I'm not just summarizing the information that I'm leaving out, but I'm indicating why it's important. At the bottom of that slide, you'll see that question, which portion of that indicates the quote significance? In my lead-in, the Attorney General suggested wrongdoing by the governor. what part of that indicates, contains the information about the quote's significance? Does the phrase "the Attorney General" indicate the quote's significance? Does the phrase "by the governor"? How about suggested wrongdoing? That's the one we're nodding at. That would be correct. The quote's the easy part. You provide the portion of the quote that you want to use. The hard part about this, though, is deciding which portion you want to use. And I've given you some examples here. If you want to focus on the full context of the Attorney General's concern, then I've got the original example that we looked at. If, however, you want to focus on the time factor, you might say the Attorney General noted that all the criminals provided the state mandated, the Attorney General noted that not all of the criminals pardoned provided the state mandated, quote, 30 days notice of their intention to seek a pardon in a local newspaper. When I only quote that portion, I'm focusing on the time factor that was not adhered to. If I want to focus on the governor not following the Constitution, I'm going to quote a different part of that. For example, the Attorney General said that not all the criminals pardoned, quote, seem to have fulfilled the Constitution's requirement. And then I go back to summary of providing advance notice of their request for a pardon. So I've used an even smaller chunk and smashed it between my writing. So in other words, you want to make sure that part of the quote that you use matches the intention you have in your writing. Take a look at that question at the bottom of that slide, please. Why do you think it's important to keep in mind, what do you think is important to keep in mind as you decide which quote chunks to use? And select any answer that you think is relevant. You can select one or more than one. Is it important to paraphrase large quotes and use only the most effective language in our quoted passages? Yes, it is. Is it important that the chunks that we use fit grammatically into the context of our whole sentences? Say yes. Yeah, it is. It's important that when chunking, we do not change the meaning of the main idea of the whole quote. That's important too, all three of those. When we talk about grammar, sometimes what will happen is that you'll pull a section of a quote out, and that section will be in past tense, and the rest of your sentence is in present tense, and those things don't work together very well. So that's what I mean about fitting grammatically. You need to make sure that things like subject-verb agreement, number, tense, that those things match up in a way so that the whole sentence that includes the quoted passage ultimately makes sense. So 1, 2, and 3. Submit. You're going to probably want to come back to this slide because when you write your response, I'm going to ask you to identify all of your quotes in this way so that I can go in and tell what transition you used and why you used it. Like, for example, for example here is to provide an example. You're going to get these categories of transitions in a moment. And then you highlight the lead-in, which goes from the Attorney General up to pardoned. And you'll say lead in, and I've paraphrased it. If your lead in is one that is supposed to suggest the significance of the passage, you can just write lead in significance. And then quote with attribution, you'll probably say that every time. We've got our quote, and I've got my attribution, my parenthetical citation. The purpose of you doing this for me is so that I know that you know what this is supposed to look like, and that you've done it intentionally. Okay. So that's what it'll look like in Google Drive once you are finished with your response. If that makes sense to you, click Got It. Anybody for whom that doesn't make sense? And how to do that?
Is this like, this is not on our talking to the Texas Department? So
No, this is going to be on your writing. You're actually going to comment on your response.
okay, so we highlight the lead-in?
Yep, you'll highlight the transition phrase that you use,
Okay.
and you'll say transition, and if it's for example, or if it's to indicate time. You'll see those categories in a moment. You highlight your lead-in and tell me, is this a summary lead-in, a paraphrase, or is it a significance lead-in? And then you'll highlight the quote and say, this is a quote with attribution. Okay. Now, based on what we've just done for the last few minutes, this is asking us the same question. I'm basically asking, have you been able to move up a little bit in the last few minutes of presentation? Have you been able to move maybe from a 2 to maybe I think I'm heading towards a 3? So if you want to give yourself a decimal value here, like we heard earlier, Walker's talking about 3.1. If you think you've moved up even a little bit into, you think you can effectively integrate those chunks with that transition lead quote format, give me my answer there. If you've stayed the same, that's fine too. It may be that you don't feel that progression until you practice this and get some support doing it, and that's fine as well. Yes, sir. Like 1 minute. Okay, go ahead and click submit. And that leads us to the end of the lesson.